Guten Tag, meine Freunde. Bon pomeriggio, amici mille. Bonjour, mes amis. Good afternoon. You got a little nervous there, didn't you? Two requests before we begin. First of all, I'd like everyone in the class to silence their cell phones. And I'm also going to ask if you'll hold your questions until the end of the presentation. I'll stay as long as you'd like and answer every one of them, but it'll help with the flow of the presentation. So thank you. When Betsy approached me to present today, I began to think about how does one share a 30-year career in, quote, 50 minutes with 10 minutes for questions, close quote. According to my math, that would be 1 minute and 30 seconds per year to share aspects of the job, the culture of the location, the political and military situation at the time, and of course, my travels, shopping, tour guiding, and lessons learned. I've decided that would be next to impossible, so instead, I'm going to share a few stories. It was hard to decide which ones of my life from 1976 when I boarded the plane at Fort Dix, New Jersey, for my first 2-year assignment in Heilbronn, Germany, until my retirement in 2006. You may wonder how I got there. On January 2nd, 1976, I was returning from a 10-day trip to Leningrad and Moscow as part of a cultural exchange program with the Soviet Union sponsored by the Research Center at Kent State University. Our mission, the 2,626 educators from the United States, Puerto Rico, and the Canal Zone, was to share a presentation regarding our country or state, and in my case, Connecticut, and learn about the educational systems in the Soviet Union. The plan was that the Russian teachers would come to the United States in return with the same mission in mind. I'm still waiting. It was my first time ever on an airplane, and trust me, at that time it was not a fast trip. First time out of the country, first time going to a location where not only did they not speak English, but they had a rather unique system of writing. I did have 2 months of Russian language training, but no written training. But that is all a story for another time. On the way back, we stopped for refueling in Norway. When I reboarded the flight, a gentleman asked me what I was doing on that flight. As we landed, after talking for the rest of the trip back, he introduced himself and told me that I was just what his school system was looking for and gave me his business card. He was the director of the military school system and suggested that I consider applying. I've been teaching in New Haven for 6 years, and since I wasn't a male, I wasn't Italian or connected, I knew at least at that time that I would be in that classroom until I retired. I also knew I had more to offer to students, the community, and the field of education. I applied and was interviewed in March and received an offer to teach in Germany for 2 years in Heilbronn. I was out-processed, filling out many, many forms by hand. Those of you that have worked for the government know there's a form for everything, and at that time, there were no computers. So I processed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. To this day, I believe they had never processed a teacher going overseas. They dealt with the military. They had more questions about what was going on than I did. In July, I received my first set of travel orders, without which I soon learned nothing could happen. I packed up my clothes and teaching supplies, of course. We were only allowed 750 pounds. Oh, by the way, when I flew home in 2006, I shipped 18,000 pounds, as I'd acquired furniture and, of course, many mementos from travel and shopping. In August, I reported to Fort Dix for my flight to Frankfurt, Germany, and the beginning of my new career overseas. I learned so much during those first 2 years. Before I continue, let me tell you a little bit about the Department of Defense Dependent Schools, DODS, overseas. I do have to tell you that in my 30-year career, they've changed the name of that agency so many times, it would take me half an hour to go through them. And researching for this presentation, it's been renamed again. It's now called the Department of Defense Education Activity, and it goes on and on. Anyway, in 2021, we celebrated our 75th anniversary celebration, and the brochure read, quote, U.S. military planners as early as 1943 had decided after World War II, dependence of military occupation forces should be brought to Germany and Japan, and that a school system should be established for them. It was believed at that time local school systems should be returned to the host government, and that they should view democratic American communities as role models for their overall reconstruction, and that military members would have higher morale and be better prepared to serve abroad if their families were with them. In September 1946, the Army opened an elementary and high school on Johnson Air Base in Japan, and a month later, the Army opened 38 elementary schools and 5 high schools in Germany and Austria, close quote. One of the most interesting things about these schools is that each of them has a host nation teacher. Host nation means wherever we were based. In addition to weekly classes for students in the local language, they often serve as the major contact with local community. They also set up the most enriching study trips, not only for the students, but members of the community, and take new hires under their wings overseas. Early on, many of these folks had worked for the U.S. during the war as translators, clerical help, and other roles as the mission dictated. My arrival in Germany. My first aha was occurring when we taxied to the terminal in Frankfurt, and I saw all of these huge Mercedes cars everywhere. When I had out-processed, they informed me that my brand new Plymouth Duster was too big to ship, and I would have to buy a car when I arrived in Germany. Oh well. As we entered the airport, I immediately noted the pairs of Polizei, German police, armed with Uzis, patrolling the airport. At first, I was a bit concerned as to what was going on, but afterwards, as I became a more seasoned traveler, I appreciated their presence, which was normal. We arrived in Frankfurt, and I was taken to the American Arms Military Hotel and Office Tower in Wiesbaden, about 20 minutes away from the airport, to await the arrival of my sponsor. Little did I know that my career would begin and end in Wiesbaden. My sponsor arrived, and off we went to Heilbronn. He was my principal, became a mentor and friend throughout my career, and even till today. I soon learned acronym E's. The military and the U.S. government have an acronym, initials, for everything. For example, if what was going to PCS, permanent change of station, then one had to have PCS orders. Every time one was reassigned, these orders began the process of packing up, getting ready to move, arranging travel, out processing at the former duty station, and upon arrival, in processing at the new duty station. One friend advised me, make multiple copies, as everyone you meet along the way will want at least one and often more. Do not give away the original. This was sage advice. When I came back to America, I had boxes of these. TDY, temporary duty orders for official travel. In other words, anywhere I would have to travel via land, air, or sea, away from my duty station, I had to have these orders, which were really permission to travel, and also get reimbursed for expenses. LQA, living quarters allowance, is a stipend provided when there's no available housing on base. All of us learned what that meant in December of 1976 in Heilbronn, when included with our annual Christmas card from Command was the notice that effective in the new year, civilians in the BOQ would no longer be living there and had to find economy housing. What that meant was we had 3 months to work with the base housing office to find a place to live outside the gate in the local community. Well, I wasn't too thrilled as my BOQ quarters were furnished. I had no car to get back and forth, and I look back at this decision, which was made with the mission in mind, which was to support the military personnel, and that was why we were there. I did worry, however, because finding housing was hard, that I might be sleeping outside the gate in a sleeping bag. Another teacher and I fortunately found a duplex house, and the military provided us each with the authorized furniture. Remember, we didn't ship any for a single person. We each got one twin bed, a table and 2 chairs. Heaven forbid we had company, a coffee table, a small sofa, and 2 lamps. The farmer who rented to us left fresh eggs each day and an occasional chicken on each of our doorstops. And by the way, they were just killed. His Frau made sure we always had some kuchen cake waiting. We were never home from school at the magic 4 o'clock hour, but she always left it for us. I never lived on base again, as it wasn't often an option for single folks. The best decision ever, as those landlords were glad to have us, our US dollars, and I know I had a new dimension of my life when I was trying to learn the language and the culture of each place I was stationed. Heilbronn, in case you're not familiar with German geography, is on the Neckar River in the southwestern part of the country near Stuttgart, which many of you may have heard of. I developed a fascination for castles here, and wherever I lived, I sought them out. I quickly developed a love for Volksmarching. Germans spend a lot of time in the outdoors in the fresh air. Walking is great for your health. These are 5 or 10 kilometers, 3.1 or 6.2-mile walks held on weekends and holidays for the most part. You pay a small fee, and in return along the walk, you pick up stamps. This is all really cool when you're doing it, to prove you made the walk, and a water, sometimes also a drink like Gatorade. At the end of the walk, your stamps are checked, and you earn the prize. It might be a medal, a souvenir plate of the area, or sometimes a little trinket. Then you follow the enticing aroma of bratwurst grilling, or sometimes a schnitzel, a fried pork sandwich, and of course pommes frites, French fries, and a beer or a soft drink or coffee. And we usually went early in the morning, so this was breakfast. I joined a group, and we went every weekend, and in the fall often did both Saturday and Sunday. And when the location was a really special one, we were known to do a 10K. As I was single, I was assigned, as I mentioned, to the BOQ, and at 28 was the oldest resident in the BOQ and one of the very few females. At the time, married teachers lived in family housing. When I arrived at the school, whose population, like so many other places during my career at this time, was overcrowded as the military mission continued to change and grow, and in this community, more and more Army personnel were brought in to provide the needed support. The principal informed me that my classroom, a repurposed Quonset hut. Until then, I had no idea what a Quonset hut was. It's kind of a metal frame, and it had tiny little windows on the top. Let me tell you, in the winter, we realized that those seams that held it together weren't exactly very tight. I did not realize at that time, but I would see many, many more of them during my career as the military forces continued to increase over time, and there was no space, as many of the facilities were repurposed German facilities. He informed me that my classroom had been dropped in by helicopter, and I missed it. Consequently, I was to go get it set up for class next week. We walked down the hallway, and there was a door on my left, which he opened, and we stepped out into my classroom in an enclosed grassy courtyard. We were surrounded by the walls of the school. The best part was that my students could step out into the courtyard, often for their own timeout, and sometimes the teacher needed a timeout. And it was a great place for science lessons. The base was great, but I had no car. One Saturday, I walked out the gate, got on the city bus, and spent the whole day exploring downtown Heilbronn. At Christmas time, I received permission from the commander to take my class to the Christmas market on the city bus on Saturday. By the time we left, I had more chaperones than students. Most of the moms had never been off base, and when I asked why, they told me they were afraid. When they saw how easy it was, they often joined me, and then later took other members of the community on their own. The best part of this, however, was watching our young students translate for their moms at the various stalls and restaurants. Two sides of the base were surrounded by vineyards, and we were invited to help with the harvest. The steep hills were hard to navigate at first, but we learned how. You know, I'd always wondered how those alpine cows never fell over, and I learned the stance. It was all worth it as we were drawn upward by the most wonderful aromas of the standard German Wurst grilled on an open fire, fresh Brötchen, which are indescribable rolls, fresh mustard, and of course, all the wine and beer we could consume. While we weren't the fastest pickers, we did enjoy the camaraderie of the locals and the wine. I taught during the week and began a life of exploration and travel that I never thought possible. I wrote home about my first trip to Tunis, Tunisia. Before that, I didn't even know where it was, and I learned they have great pottery. The DER travel company offered what we call special deals for American school teacher. We heard that all over the world, by the way. Whether it was a 3-day weekend or holidays such as spring break or winter break or summer vacation, there were multiple offerings. During those 2 years, I've traveled, remember, I'd never been out of the country. Tunis, London, Amsterdam, Paris. Spent November of that first year, Thanksgiving in Budapest, and went back years later for the best New Year's Eve party I've ever been to. In April spring break, we spent in Ireland. Driving on the wrong side of the road, however, was not what I expected, but my friend, who promised to drive, forgot her license. And lambing season was in session. I calculate I took 300 pictures of those cute little lambs. You know, they don't walk, they hop. They had no consideration, however, for the windy roads through the mountains. Hit one, you pay a big fine, which includes the lamb as well as all of the lost offspring from the future. Of course, each one did have a big red X sprayed on each side, which signaled, I have the right of way. In March, I traveled to Liechtenstein, which is a principality. Again, I'd never heard of it, between Switzerland and Austria. It was regal and so beautiful. And then I finished out the year in Cairo, Egypt, and met my first and last camel. We signed up for a camel caravan through the pyramids. Camels are nasty. They spit at you, and the drivers would collect what was called bakshish. You want to get up off the ground? Bakshish was $1. If you want to get off the camel to go see the pyramids, bakshish. You get the picture? This went on for a week. Thank goodness I had a lot of American dollars. The first 2 years for me were an eye-opener. These students were so resilient. The average military child attends 3 schools during their elementary years. High schoolers may never complete 4 years in the same high school, although over the years that has been improving. Children PCS in and out of the classroom all the time as military members' tour of duty was over, and it was time to move on. We always had a student class sponsor who showed the newbies their desk and helped them through their routines. Each one of these students had been through it, so they knew what to expect. I was home my first first summer in Connecticut, and I'd already signed another travel agreement for another 2 years. A telegram arrived offering me a teaching principalship in Hondorf, Germany. There were few female administrators, and I was thrilled, although we couldn't find it on the map. So I went back and packed out, and I received directions from the office of the superintendent to drive northwest and exit the Autobahn at Hondorf. Well, the 300-mile trip was wonderful. We went from rolling hills to very flat land, no rivers to speak of, and there were lots of farms. I kept looking for the Hondorf exit. I'd get off the Autobahn and get back on, as I had been given the note. If I reached Bremerhaven, I'd gone too far. I finally pulled into a police station on the Autobahn. I think they had been watching the lady in the red car go past and then come back, and anyway, I walked in and explained that I was looking for the Hondorf exit, and they went, "There is no Hondorf exit," told me to take the Münster exit, and told me how to get to the base. I found the exit, and I followed the directions. I was on a narrow country road with a farm on my left and small buildings on the right. The narrow 2-lane paved road ended, and there was a block-like road in front of me with upended blocks on either side. Sort of looked like somebody had taken bricks and stuck them in the ground on one point. I kept going, and suddenly coming towards me is a tank. You know, one of those big things with a gun on the front? I still remember, even as I'm talking about, hitting that brake so hard I almost went through the window, and I did stall the car. I saw someone coming out of the top, and by now I was really nervous because I didn't know what Army, Air Force, whatever he was with. I waited. I had military plates on my car, and I think that helped as he approached, because he didn't know who I was either, other than some lady who didn't belong there. He was a British military, and so polite. And I don't know what he was saying, but anyway. The U.S. mission here was to repair those tanks, which no one had told me. He asked me what I was doing on the tank trail. Well, I kind of babbled on the new principal. Well, finally, he looked at my orders, my ID, said welcome, and said, "Your school, you passed it." It was right next to a building that I had passed, which had concertina wire and also was derelict. So this had been a former Dutch base after the Germans left, and then the British took it over on one side, and the Americans repaired the tanks on the other. I also learned you can't turn around on the tank trail because I would have taken out my tires and ruined my brand new red car. So I learned what a ground guide was. Remember, we didn't have backup cameras in those days. And they guided me back and went to the school. So the British sergeant there welcomed me and took me to my quarters. After showing me this beautiful house with linens and crystal and silver, and even a room for my staff. And then he said, oh, by the way, he had this big ring of keys. Everything had a lock on it. He said, "When's your husband arriving?" I was speechless, and I said, "He isn't. I'm not married." No joke. He did an about-face, took the keys away, and said, "This housing is only designated for married officers." Well, I was considered an officer, but didn't meet the criteria. We went back to the school. He called the host nation teacher, and she got me a room in a local guest house and said, "Don't worry." By the next morning, she'd called the landlady of the former single principal, and the apartment was still available, and I moved in. In Hondorf, we had a very small school, 4 teachers. We each taught 2 grades, and then I principaled whenever I could fit it in. The students, though, were wonderful. They loved it because we were on our own. They had a job in the morning at recess, chase the ground moles away. On the area we used as a playground, we had no equipment. You know what ground moles do. It was very dangerous. They kind of mound up the ground. So the morning recess, we all went out and stomped, which scared them away. They didn't like the vibration. And that way, we had a nice playground for lunchtime. As we were a remote site, and the principal didn't have many issues. We didn't get many visitors from HQ or anywhere else. One day, the host nation teacher came down to my room and she said, "There's a visitor in the office." She took my class, and as I arrived at the office, he introduced himself and he handed me a paper to sign. It was my annual performance appraisal. I'd never met him. I had not heard from him ever except when I got the dreaded weekly packet from headquarters, which meant I would spend the weekend writing reports. I was speechless. If that had happened now, I'd probably have said, "Are you kidding me?" But, I'm new. That incident stayed with me, and in addition to becoming the topic for my doctoral dissertation 3 years later, shaped how I supervised my staffs from then on. He then asked me if the host nation teacher could take him to the nearby blanket factory. I could not believe it, but I learned something. Whenever we had VIP visitors, shopping trips were expected, no matter where one was stationed. And I could do a whole presentation on all the outlets in the world, if you're interested, and where to shop. And it was also interesting, people only traveled to visit us during certain times. And in Germany, it was the German Christmas market time in December, Oktoberfest, Fasching, which was the German equivalent of Mardi Gras, and the Easter egg market. Now, I'm sure it was just coincidental that they did their site visits during that time. My next assignment was in Gießen, Germany. You may recognize Gießen, as Elvis Presley was assigned there in the 50s. Many Germans would tell tales of meeting him or ask if I knew him. Now, he was there in the 50s, and this was 1980. I was assigned to this school with over 700 students, K-8. This was a huge community. We had rows of trailers in the back to accommodate overcrowding. In addition, we also had high school students, and at this time, they took a 5-day train to the 5-day dorm in Frankfurt, which was about 33 miles away. Remember, these kids are only 14 years old. And in 1985, a new high school was built. And at that time, we ended up with the large elementary, over 420 students in the middle school, and 400 in the high school. I'm just giving you this to get this expansiveness of the amount of troops were overseas and the number of students we served. That building project did come with a few issues. By then, I was assistant superintendent in the Frankfurt schools, and the principal called me to let me know that, oh, by the way, the construction's been halted. They had uncovered a 250-pound World War II bomb that was live, and the construction could not resume until they resolved, as he said, this little issue. Also at that time, the German Green Party had frequent protests at the site of the school because it was in the middle of a wooded area. Now, we had all the approvals that we needed, but you know how that goes. And it was a beautiful forest. There were beautiful rhododendron and mushrooms, a fall staple in the German diet. In an interview with the construction workers, they described the school site at that time in 1983 as a fairy tale-like setting and the prettiest campus in Dodge, Europe, because it was one of the first new builds. I wanted to give you a taste of how things worked. Wherever the troops were, and we had 100 students, K-8, we provided a school and always a first-class education. After that, I was assigned to Frankfurt, and I had 3 assignments there, and it really wasn't because I couldn't keep a job. I became the cleanup lady. So if there was a problem, they'd tell me what it was, and I was to go in and try to fix it. Well, that year, I had my toughest assignment. I was sent to the junior high school, 7-9 school, and our 9th graders hated it because the high school was on the other side of town, but there was no room for the 9th grade. It was tough because they'd lost the focus on students, which does happen. Many of these people had been there forever, didn't want to move, and loved it, but they, to be honest, a lot of them needed to retire. First day told me all I needed to know as to why I had been assigned there. I had taught middle schoolers, and for those of you in the audience that were teachers, you know about middle schoolers. And if you're a parent, you know about middle schoolers. After endless meetings with the staff for 2 weeks, before classes began, we had everything cleaned up and I thought ready, including the principal personally replanting the entry hall gardens, which were dead when I arrived. I don't think they'd been touched in years. The first day, after greeting each student as they stepped off the bus, I came back into the building. Every one of those plants was defoliated. I was not a happy principal. I worked with the staff and students on expectations and spent most of the year out in the halls making sure everything was the way it should be and that teachers were teaching and students were learning. I only had to replant one more time. The commander at this particular concern had a cannon at the flagpole, and every day at 5 o'clock when the flag was taken down and taps played, the cannon would be fired. Mind you that on every base at that time, that same procedure would go. Everyone, military, civilian, stopped, stood at attention, hand over your heart, or at salute, until the flag was down and taps was over. On this day, I was still in the building. I heard the cannon and the building shook more than usual. This building was sort of a half Quonset hut, half leftover building from the war. I looked up and my IT tech is standing there, white as a sheet, with a huge disk from the computer that held our schedules and all the student records. The concussion had taken out the windows in the computer Quonset hut, and there was glass everywhere. I gave him credit for grabbing it and ran, because we might have lost everything. A few minutes later, we received the all clear, and to this day, I believe someone perhaps overloaded the cannon. Fortunately, this is a very small base, so we're all close. The cannon was parallel to the building. If it hadn't been, I might not be standing here. I then became the deputy superintendent in that district, as it was a new position because we had so many schools, and all during this, new schools are opening wherever they were needed. So my job was to supervise them. At this time, there were 240 from the original 30-some in Germany alone. Today, there are about 240 worldwide. So you can see how many bases have closed and how many schools have closed. I never felt unsafe, however, during my career, ever. I felt more unsafe when I PCS back to DC and worked in this district for a year. During that time, we were besieged by incidents from the Baader-Meinhof gang. Some of you may remember them. Later on became the Red Army. When I was in Gießen, we had a car bomb go off in the housing area. Fortunately, there was a few minor injuries, a lot of facility damages, but they never went after people, really, intentionally. When I was living in Frankfurt, I had come out of the car wash. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving, and I had my car washed and gotten my stuff for Thanksgiving and was going home, and I heard this explosion behind me. Well, I didn't think anything of it. You know, maybe it was a car backfire. Who knows? And I lived about 3 blocks away, and when I got home, everything that had been on shelves was now on the floor. A few minutes later, the call came. There had been another bomb by this same group planted at the car wash. Unfortunately, fortunately that day, no one was in the car wash. However, there was a lot of damage to adjacent buildings during that time. One of our former students wrote an article for our 75th anniversary. She's now a reporter for a newspaper in one of the states, I can't remember, regarding that day, and she compared it to 9/11. Quote, "You see, we know this is nothing new. Each time, we hope it never happens again." Close quote. Often I'd have a meeting in the Abrams building in downtown Frankfurt, which was on a big concern of a high school, lots of office buildings. But But there was also the command quarters there. Many of our facilities I mentioned were former Nazi facilities. This one was the former location of the IG Farben company that manufactured, among other things, chemicals for the poison in the gas chambers. Workers were slave laborers from Auschwitz. This facility was now the U.S. Army Europe headquarters. I'd heard about some of these things that were in the building, and of course, being a history person, I was kind of curious, but never asked. One day, a staffer who got to know me motioned me into the command office. He lifted a tapestry off the wall, and behind it was the remaining swastika from World War II. I didn't even know what to say, and I still talking about it get chills because I think about who was sitting at that desk during that time. I always wondered if that was a reminder that we never forget, or perhaps a constant reminder to us all why we were there. 9/11 was the fall of Der Mauer, the Berlin Wall. Did you know the Berlin Wall was 12 feet high and 27 miles long? And afterwards, you can come up and take a look at a depiction. But also, there were two other walls. Berlin itself was ensconced in a fence of 28 miles, and there was a 75-mile wall that ran around West Berlin. By the way, we had troops stationed in West Berlin, and that meant families, and we also had schools there. Many of our students walked by that wall every day on the way to school. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked major changes, not only in the military force structure in Germany, but also major changes for our school system. The night Der Mauer came down was historic. I'd traveled to Berlin both on duty and for pleasure, and I remember riding the military duty train with the windows covered so we couldn't see anything in East Germany. Not our choice, their choice. And walking through Checkpoint Charlie after repeated checks of documents, the required purchase of a specified amount of East German marks, which were checked on the way back out against one's receipts. And the leftovers better be there because they had to be returned. I did sneak one out in my tennis shoe, and I have it. I figured if they wanted my shoe, they could have it. And there was no refund. People often saw the graffiti on the west side of the wall, but on the back side was nothing but stark black and white, as was all of East Germany. It was said when the wall came down, those former East German guards just picked up their weapons and ran for fear that we would shoot them. Years later, when I returned, the devastation is still evident. We drove, and I still remember we only got a few meters of paved road, and the rest was still broken up, and buildings were full of bullet holes. Following that, I was transferred to Kaiserslautern, which is the hub of the largest concentration of Americans overseas. Just to give you an idea, we had in that community, in Army side of town, now these bases are only like 10, 15 minutes apart, we had Army. We had two high schools, a middle school and a high school, all of them huge and overcrowded. Ramstein, which was an Air Force base, we had two elementary schools, middle school, and a high school. And on each of these bases, you couldn't walk among the buildings. You had to drive because the bases were big and we had such big schools. And then Landstuhl, which, if you listen to the news, was the home of the Army Regional Medical Center. We had a K-8 school there, too, bursting at the seams, because as military actions took place, most of our wounded service members were brought into Landstuhl first for treatment before being sent back to the States or back to duty. That facility is now purple because all the services have a part of it. Not long after I arrived, I received one of those dreaded calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was to report to base for a meeting. 3 o'clock in the morning is not good. This was the beginning of what became known as Desert Shield and Desert Storm. we did not close schools. By the next morning, I met with the principals at Ramstein because the airstrikes were being flown out of Ramstein. 3 flights out and silence. 3 flights out and silence. On top of the schools, there was an armed guard on every corner of every one of these schools that I've named to you to make sure that our students were safe. And I need to tell you, during all of the actions, I came back to the States and I was surprised how many people didn't really know about Bosnia and, a lot of things that were happening in the Middle East and so forth. But I have to tell you, the most school we ever missed was maybe a day until we could get guards and so forth in place to make sure we were safe. Because a lot of these bases at that time didn't have gates, but that changed after 9/11. The best thing for us was what do you do for these service members? They are on 12-hour guard duty outside the perimeter, inside the perimeter, and they can't go anywhere. So the Wives Club, we got together. Station wagons were loaded with all hours. We all had a shift, and we had coffee and cocoa and tea, and the local restaurants brought in meals for these folks just because they wanted us to know that they were supported. Now, my contribution was what I called mega muffins, and they were about this big. These guys needed nutrition. At my Hail and Farewell, which is a military party when people are coming into the community or leaving, when the commander got up to do my little roast, he said, and I'm quoting, "She single-handedly caused my service members to all miss their weight goals during Desert Storm and Desert Shield." That wasn't true. They really didn't. The wall had come down, and now we had troops leaving. They didn't need them anymore in Germany and other locations, but Germany was the hardest hit. Between 1991 and 95, we closed 100 schools in Germany. And then when I moved to Italy, we were plussing up because the mission had moved to the Middle East. Best thing about that was that no one who worked for us lost a job. We worked very difficultly. All the superintendents and the principals, what's vacant, who do you have, what are they qualified for? It was like a puzzle game. But anyone who wanted to stay could. The only caveat was when they got an offer, if they didn't like it, then they were terminated. There were also offers for early retirement, buyouts, and so forth. But I was pretty proud of that because in my whole area of responsibility, I only had one person who I had a problem with. She wasn't qualified to teach much of anything, and the program she did teach was no longer, it was a cosmetology. And you've got to have a big school to have a cosmetology program. So we gave her option. If you go back and get certified, we'll bring you back on. And she opted not to do that. Oh, and by the way, we're placing hundreds of teachers, administrators. Mount Pinatubo blew in 1991 in the Philippines. Clark Air Force Base was decimated. We had many schools there, and we also had to place all those teachers and administrators. So I think we did a pretty good job about that. I will tell you, by 1994, I needed a timeout, so I treated myself to a trip to Eilat in Israel, which is a lovely beach area, and I fulfilled a lifelong dream to walk the Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem and spend Christmas in Bethlehem. It was pretty special. At that time, I was reassigned. You think all I did was move and travel. From 1995 to 2000, I was assigned to Caserma, Italy, in Vicenza, Italy, and my area responsibility was Italy, Sardinia, Sicily, and Bahrain. Finding housing was not easy because the military members and their families, remember we're doing all these plus-ups, are also looking as base housing was full and economy houses were limited. I was spoiled, though. For 3 months, I lived in a little Italian hotel, and every day when I got home from work, waiting in my room was a plate with fruit and cheese and crackers and a bottle of wine. I think about that now. I did not drink all those bottles of wine, trust me. Well, maybe I heard that. Anyway, so I was staffer there found me a beautiful 6-bedroom villa. And I'm going, oh, geez. So the military agreed to provide additional furniture because when I had visitors, I always offered them to stay with me. I knew what it was like to be traveling all the time, and hotels get really old, so it was really nice. So they provided some additional furniture, and I lived in a little town outside Vicenza called Montegalda. And guess what? There was a vineyard right next door. Now, they weren't too keen on my helping to pick, but during the season, I'd come home, and on the brick wall between our properties would always be a new bottle of wine. So it was okay. Really, I'm not a lush, but it sort of sounds like it. I will tell you one thing about Italy. I learned to be patient. First of all, I had to pay the vigilantes, the security police, to make sure that the gypsies didn't rob my villa when I was away, or sometimes even when I was there. Now, I will tell you, the gypsies never went after people. They only wanted stuff, like your jewelry and your technology. Mostly stuff, though, they could put in their pockets, so they'd come in and out. They trained their kids to steal. It was a whole nother culture. Could probably do an hour on the gypsies. So each month I paid the fee to the vigilante, and on Saturday, if I was home, I would see them, and they would always ask if everything was okay, and I would say yes, and so forth. And I also always had a little cappuccino or espresso for them and American baked goods. The Italians loved our baked goods because they had more sugar in them, of course. I traveled frequently to visit my schools and to go to meetings outside of Italy, so it was worth it. One day, my landlord came and he called me outside the gate, and he showed me the mark on one of my security posts. That was the sign to the gypsies that I was paid up and they weren't to try anything because the vigilantes would come after them. And I got to tell you, the two guys that came around the cart, I didn't think they could do stuff, but they did have Uzis, so I guess they could. Getting settled was an adventure in Italy. I learned so much patience, well, sort of. First thing, I needed electricity. You know, you go in and you think, oh, oops, no electricity. So I go to the electric company, and a wizened old man with a green eye shade is sitting there, and he had this huge ledger on the desk. Called me to the counter, checked my lease, and recorded my payment in cash. He handwrote the receipt. They did not start computerized billing until I was PCSing out of the country. I figure it kept people employed. At some point, years later, as I said, they converted. But when I PCSed out, he had put my lira in a pile with my name on it in this big metal safe behind him. A lot of piles of lira. And when I PCSed out, I had to go back. My bill was paid up, and I got my pile of lira back. It was so funny. Oh, signora, domani, dopo domani. That was a frequent response to any when question. It literally means tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But what it really means is days, weeks, or months. I had to have a telephone pole. You're required to have a phone. And landlines were still only the major option. A trip to another office. First of all, I handed my lease in. Well, there's no residence at this address. Oh, yes, there is. Then I was informed I couldn't have a phone connection because I did not have a telephone pole. Now, I want to know, how many of you have built a house? Did you ever look for a telephone pole? Isn't that kind of part of the plan? Wouldn't you think a new build would have one? Not in Italy. Oh, yes, and I had to pay for it. And it had to come from Rome, 5 hours away. And a special permit was required to transport it on the autostrada. When I PCSed, I asked if I could have it, as I'd paid for it. And I received an emphatic no. I waited and waited. One day I came home and there was a telephone pole right outside my fence that had arrived that day and had been installed. However, I noted a worker sitting atop of the pole as I entered the security gate and got out. He began singing, Oh, solo mio. I'm not sure if the words that went with it were the real words. The guy on the ground began yelling at me in Italian, broken English, asking where I'd been as they needed to get inside the villa to make the final connections. Apparently, a postcard was sent, which I never received, giving me the date and time of the install. Well, it took them like 3 seconds to make the connection, but it was too late for them to start back to Rome. So, being a gracious hostess who was not cooking dinner, we went up the street to a local restaurant where I'd been taking meals because my kitchen had not arrived yet. The house did not have a kitchen either, which was very typical. There were no closets overseas, so you bought closets because if you put closets into your build, that was taxed as another room. And so I got really good at going to IKEA, whatever you call it, and getting cabinets because I usually just sold them to the people moving in because it was easier than taking it apart. And I'm not sure they would have come apart and gone back together. So anyway, I didn't have a kitchen, so we went to the restaurant and we came back. They slept in the van, and in the morning I gave them an American breakfast, and off they went. I'm going to tell you one more story about Italy, and then I'm going to stop there because I know some of you have a birthday party to go to. I've already been informed. I believe I'm the only superintendent in the world that hired ferry monitors, Ferry, just to clarify. La Maddalena is a little island off the coast of Sardinia. The mission there was a very, very large ship, which was a subtender. And the service members' families lived on the island of Sardinia. But the headquarters and the school were on La Maddalena, which if you look at a map, you can barely, it's a little dot off the coast. So what happened? In the morning, the buses would pick up the kids, and in many cases, the parents brought them to the port of Palau. They got on the ferry, which people used all day long. It wasn't just for them. And I had to have monitors to make sure they were safe and nobody went overboard. You know, the usual things with kids. Because parents didn't have time to be doing that. And I agreed, although we did have volunteers. So they'd get to the port of La Mad, and then we'd have a bus waiting, taking them up the winding road to the school. And we had a really cute little school there, and it was a great environment, and the kids loved it. However, this superintendent dreaded this trip. It was a narrow, winding road up to the school, past hillsides of plastic bags. I used to call it Trashmore, but it really wasn't trash. It was just years and years of go to Harris Teeter, those plastic kind of bags. They were everywhere. Had great pictures. Unfortunately, I don't have any. The principal finally started bringing saltine crackers for me to munch on as we wound around the road to the school. You can figure out probably why. In case you might recognize it, however, this is also the location of the Costa Esmeralda, the emerald coast with crystal clear blue waters. And on the other side of the island is where the rich and famous, stars, politicians, etc., have their exotic vacation mansions and estates. Italy was an adventure. It took everything to get things done, but in the end, we had quality work. When we opened our new schools, our kids' lunches were provided by a local Italian restaurant. It was amazing. So I'm going to stop there because I'm getting overtime, and I'd like to answer any questions that you might have. I did finish my career in Wiesbaden, as I said, and that's a whole nother presentation because I traveled so much. I was a troubleshooter at that time. I'll also be glad if you want to come up, and I'll explain what these pictures are about. They're just some of the things that I've collected from places that I've been. So, thank you. Any questions? Okay, Warren. It's the same as we're all federal employees, so we use the federal system. And I have to say, I'm really glad I have it. Yeah, I was a GS 15 when I retired, as high as you can go before you enter senior executive service. And I'd been there 30 years, and it was time for me to come back to the States because I hadn't lived here. I will tell you, when I came back in 2006, it was culture shock because so much had changed. And it was almost like another PCS move to another country. You know, things had changed so much. So, yeah. Sandy? Actually, for the most part, because of the track I was on, they would call me in and say, look, we've got this situation here. Are you willing? And there was only one time that I did not, I did take advantage of, you got to be kidding me. Um, my mom came to live with me after the death of my dad, and they wanted to send me to Korea, and I knew she would not be able to handle it. And so I had a little chat, and I said, if we can't work this out, because they wanted me to go deal with the situation in Korea, I said, I'll just quit. And they went, no, you won't. And they gave me orders to Italy. So I thought that was a pretty good trade-off. Anyway, any other questions? Way in the back, I can't see who you are. Oh, yes. In country, we used the local currency, whatever it was, off base. On base, we used dollars. No, none at all. The only thing that I'll share with you, because I brought this, in 2001, Europe went to the euro. And this was my welcome to the euro packet, because what we had to do at that time was turn in, and in my case, because I traveled, I called it the European travel wallet. It had compartments in it. So my normal was US dollars, Deutschmarks, French francs, British pounds, Italian lira, Turkish lira, and sometimes I kept Austrian shillings because I like to go down there because it was so nice. And so what you had to do at the time that happened was go to your local bank, and because I was living on the economy, I had to have a local bank account. So I went and, like Deutschmarks, they looked at my Deutschmark account, and they said, oh, now you have this many euros in your pocketbook, and this is your welcome. I never opened it because I thought it was a cool souvenir. But what happened over time, and if you had, like now, if you travel, you turn in the money and you can get dollars or whatever you want. Or like me, I have a container that I kept coins from everywhere I traveled in the world. I have stuff from countries that don't exist. And my thing was, when I came back to the States, I was going to have a necklace made. Well, I couldn't have stood up because the guy told me he recommended I not do that. I'll just leave it there. So I've got that. I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet. But yeah, we didn't have any restrictions. And at that time, even up in, when I was stationed in Hondorf, once a month we went to Bremerhaven because the military was paid in cash. We didn't have an American bank. So once a month I would hop a ride with the finance officers. And I would do my personnel business, pick up supplies, and we had a little mini tiny American commissary. And so if the commissary officer would take orders, and then they'd come down from Bremerhaven and bring them. But sometimes the commissary ran out of things. And let's just say I always made sure I had a case of peanut butter because that was a big grievance. You know what a grievance is from a union? Well, we had 2 unions. And I will never forget my first grievance was over the fact there was no peanut butter in the commissary. Nothing about, oh, we need more books for the kids or more pencils. No, we need peanut butter. And it wasn't for the kids, it was for these people. I'll just leave it at that. Did I answer your question? Okay, Judy. Well, yes, I'm traveled out. When I started out, way back when, air travel was fun. People dressed. They didn't look like they just crawled out of bed. they took a bath, those kind of things. And I call because I traveled so much, I got points, and the government decided we could keep our points. It was a little thank you for doing all this. And I traveled, but even in business and first class, I still call it the Greyhound bus in the sky. And it's going to take something really special to get me on a plane again. For many reasons. There are all these crazy people flying, I don't want to open the door and him to open the door and I get sucked out. Gross. Maybe someday. Now, I am planning to do a lot more travel on the ground starting in January. Jack, did you have your... Yeah. Okay, well, what happened was when I retired, I was pretty young, and a friend of mine, who after she did this to me was no longer a friend, not really. She was trying to be kind. She said, Candace, you are too young to retire. You will wilt on the vine. Well, I don't wilt, but anyway. So she offered me a position with a nonprofit in DC that she was heading up. And they wanted to start a for-profit division, which was to sell products that up to that time they had been giving to school systems for free. But it was such a lucrative market and had good research base and all that. So my assignment was to set up the for-profit. So I retired from the military school system on a Friday. I flew home to DC on Saturday, and Monday began the job at the nonprofit. One of the reasons that I really decided to retire was I flew so much, especially starting in Italy. Even my landlord in Italy said, why do you rent this place? I was only there 1 week a month because I felt very strongly that my place was not in an office. It was out in those schools and communities dealing. So I flew a lot. So anyway, but I was really getting tired, and when I came back, they told me I had no internal clock anymore because I was always crossing time zones, especially when I went to the Pacific, which if you've done that, it's a very long trip. So anyway, I worked for that, setting up. I got the nonprofit set up, and by March, the for-profit set up, I couldn't do it anymore. I would get a call, oh, we have a possible client in LA. There'll be a ticket at the Dulles Gate, whatever, tomorrow morning, and then you can come back on the red eye. And I was like, wait a minute. And I did about 10 of those trips. So in June, I did not renew my contract and had to move to Charlottesville without the second salary. I could no longer afford to live in Arlington and Washington. So I moved to Charlottesville because I had gone to what I called charm school. The federal government has a school in Charlottesville. It's called the Federal Executive Academy. And when you reach a certain level, you are sent there for a month of training. Basically, rules of the United States Constitution, what that means, things that you can do when you are in countries that we have to be careful of. There was a lot of that, and I didn't go into that, but whenever you went anywhere, they said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't shake hands here, don't, all that kind of stuff. So I was there, and I enjoyed it so much because everybody else got to go home. Classes were Sunday night until Friday at noon, and there were only a couple of us that were from overseas because the rest of the folks were based in the United States, so because they could hop a flight and go home. Well, I couldn't do that because by the time I flew back to Frankfurt, it would be time to get on the flight to come back so I could be there at noontime. So being resourceful, I would walk down the street, and I met some people at the bank because they made arrangements so we could cash checks and stuff. So I got to know one of the tellers, and one day he says, "You're so nice. Can I ask you a question?" I thought, oh. He said, "What do you do up there? Because this place is secure." I mean, well, because of who's there. And so I said, well, we're in school for a month and we're learning about Constitution, because I didn't tell him all this stuff. But, the big three that were there for that conference. He said, do you know what the people in Charlottesville think? And I looked at him and I said, what? He said, they think that's where they send federal executives to dry out because they're alcoholics. The rest of that story is part of our charm school part was how to nurse a drink through a cocktail hour so that you didn't get loaded and spill the beans. So I thought that was very amusing. So what happened, I moved to Charlottesville and then sort of began my third career. I started out volunteering and ended up working 8 years at the hospital there as first as the weekend concierge, because nobody else wanted to work the weekends. I didn't have family, and I had one premise: if you make sure that I can get to church on Sunday, so the security guard would stay until I got on duty. And I did that for the 8 years. And matter of fact, some of you know this, I finished up working in the hospital on Memorial Day, packed out on Tuesday, and was down here on Wednesday moving in upstairs. And here I am, you're stuck with me until I go to the loading dock.